Hello everyone, I'm Apsley, and today I'm going to show you how to paint these orchid flowers in watercolor. This is a Phalaenopsis, which is also known as a moth orchid. For this painting, I'm going to be using hot press watercolor paper on a block, which keeps the paper nice and flat. I started with a light pencil drawing on my reference photo. I took this photo of this particular orchid at a nursery recently, and it caught my eye because every bloom on the inflorescence has a unique pattern. Let's take a look at my palette for some of the colors that we're going to want to use. Cobalt Violet is this nice lighter toned violet purple hue. Quinacridone Rose is a more intense reddish tone that will also be useful. And then we have Quinacridone Violet for our darker tones. For this first wash of color, I'm just going to use a lot of water, go very light, and primarily use the Cobalt Violet with a slight mix of Quinacridone Rose. As with every watercolor painting, we want to start very light and work our way towards darker tones. I'm going to go ahead and start defining some of these bold shapes and bright colors on the labellum. Got some Quinacridone Rose mixture on my brush. And I want to fill in this shape following along with my reference photo, but making sure that it doesn't look too flat. There's a subtle bit of yellow inside the labellum. I'm just going to use a bit of yellow ochre to paint that in. Now I'm going to use the darker toned Quinacridone Violet along with some Quinacridone Rose to mix a much darker violet tone to use on the very interior of the labellum. Just want to define these shapes of the lip of the flower. We can add more subtle shading and detail later on. This is a little bit of the sepal showing through that needs to be dropped into shadow with some Cobalt Violet. And this just helps define the very center column of the orchid a little bit better. Now I've got a little bit stronger mixture of Cobalt Violet on its own to start to define some of these areas around the center of each flower. Cobalt Violet really is the perfect color here, and I don't need to mix it with much else. Just using less water and more paint, I can get a darker tone that stands out more. Go ahead and use Cobalt Violet to start painting the base tone of the lower flower here. Cobalt Violet has a real graininess quality to it, which is called granulation due to the size of the pigment itself in the paint. It can be a very beautiful effect in some situations, but we'll try to minimize it here by making a bunch of smaller brush strokes and smoothing out the surface of the petals as much as possible, and we'll go back over it with other layers of color later. Now I'm taking my small liner brush and actually doing a little bit of outlining here. It's something you want to be careful with and not overdo it so that your painting looks cartoony. Generally, you want to create contrast between two overlapping objects without drawing a line like this, but it can be useful to create definition to help your subject pop, if done in a very subtle way. is kind of like the nose of the orchid, and we really want it to look like it's popping out towards us. So we can do that by darkening all these areas around it and underneath it, dropping them into shadow. Now that I'm happy with the overall base tone of the orchid and some of the shading we've got going, I'm going to go ahead and start adding some dots. Definitely don't want to do this any earlier in the process because small little spots of pigment like this are hard to paint over. They'll bleed and cause problems if you paint other layers on top of them. This bottom orchid doesn't have very many spots, but it has that nice subtle feathery veining texture on the solid petals. So I'm going to go ahead and paint that in with more of our same Cobalt Violet in a small brush and get some of that detail in there. We want to make sure that this veining, which is a lot like the veining on a leaf, looks like a soft texture, not like a pattern the way that the spots are. So as I said before, each flower on this particular orchid is a little bit unique. So this middle blossom has larger spots, and I'm going to use a little bit larger brush and continue painting those spots with our Cobalt Violet. And for the spots on the sepals, I'm going to mix a slightly darker shade of violet because the sepals are a bit more in shadow than the petals. I'm darkening some of the areas of the labellum here that fall into shadow to create a more three-dimensional look to this part of the flower. And we'll add a small shadow to the very tip of the column and the center of the flower to make that look rounded and three-dimensional. This is just a little bit of Payne's Gray warmed up with some yellow ochre. Now that these spots are dry, I'm going to go back and add a darker center to each one of the larger spots. This color I'm using isn't much darker, but it looks darker because it's 2 layers now. And let's go ahead and bring that same level of detail into the flower at the top. For the backs of these other flowers that are peeking up from behind, I'm just going to do some impressionistic spots since we're seeing them through the back of the petals. I want them to look a little bit looser, lighter, and less defined than the spots on the other flowers. And we'll finish off this painting with some detail added to these buds at the tip of the inflorescence. This color is called green gold, and I'm going to use it to help bring together the color of the green stem of the flower onto the buds themselves, just by blending it right from the stem onto the buds. And we'll finish off the stem with some Oxide of Chromium green, mixed with a bit of French Ultramarine and green gold. Okay, that's it for this Phalaenopsis orchid painting. Be sure to check out my channel for more videos and tutorials. Thanks for watching.